Hello, welcome back, welcome to Frequencies, tuning in to frequencies of human behavior, perspective, and empathy. I'm Matt, and today we're wrapping up our generation series with the Millennials. Hooray! Everybody else is going to hate that, but Millennials, the best generation of all time. That's us. That's correct. We started off with the silent generation, and then we moved into the baby boomers. And the last episode, we covered Gen X. Now we land here with the Millennials. And their story, our story, feels a little different because I say that from the inside. I am one. More specifically, I'm actually what's often called an exennial. And honestly, even that term is a little fuzzy to me. Some people say exennial, some people say zennial. I don't even know the right way to say it. But generally, it refers to that micro generation between Gen X and the Millennials, roughly late 70s to early 80s. I was born 1984, so I sit right on the edge. And technically, I'm a millennial, but with a foot somewhat in both worlds. Millennials as a whole are usually defined as those born between 1980 and 1996. But here's where it gets interesting. And maybe this is just my perspective being inside it, but millennials don't really feel like just one generation, in my opinion. It feels like two, maybe even three. And if you split it up, you can almost clearly see three distinct groups, in my opinion. Those born in the early 80s like myself, those born in the late 80s into the early 90s, and then the younger millennials at the tail end of it, closer to 96. Those groups, they're totally different, in my opinion. I see it in my own family. I have a brother born in 1980, and my sister was born in 1988. We're similar in a lot of ways, but our upbringings were different. Not in a good or bad sense, just different. And a big part of that comes down to how fast the world was changing while we were growing up. It wasn't gradual. It was fast. It was rapid. And every generation might do that. Every generation, I'm curious if every generation says their older people in that generation are totally different than the younger ones. I would assume it's pretty common. I'm not sure. But as far as the millennials, in those three different phases, those three different micro generations, in my opinion, with technology, culture, the economy changing so fast, just everything was shifting in real time. And that brings me to what I think is one of the defining traits of millennials. So we've experienced extreme economic ups and downs at a critical stage in life, not just witnessing them, but trying to build lives through them at critical times. Yes, other generations lived through the same moments as well. The boomers, they were there. Gen X, they were there. But millennials were coming of age. They were getting into adulthood, trying to choose careers, start families, establish stability, right as multiple major financial crises hit. And that timing matters. It's one thing to experience economic instability when you're already established, and it's another thing entirely when you're just trying to get started. Now, is it the Great Depression? No. Some might say we're in a silent depression, but different conversation, different day. But at times, it doesn't feel that far removed from the Great Depression. So before I get too far ahead of myself, let's just go ahead and dive right in here. Let's tune in to Frequencies. Welcome back to Frequencies. This is the final episode of season 1. I know you guys are so sad, so just distraught. I apologize. And this is also the final installment of the Generations miniseries. I know this has been the whole world is talking about it. But yes, we're wrapping it up here. And today we're going to talk about the Millennials. We've already covered the silent generation and baby boomers and Gen X. Along the way, I mentioned possibly doing an episode for Gen Z, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like their story just isn't fully formed yet. To be blunt, they just haven't gone through enough. Sorry. And at least not in a way that gives us a complete generation arc to analyze. Their time is coming. Unfortunately, my son's Gen Z, my daughter's Gen Alpha, so I have tons to say about them, but really it's more about potential fears and things to look forward to for that generation. So unless something changes, unless millennials, along with Gen X and maybe even the boomers, God forbid, can shift the trajectory just a bit. I mean, I'm being a little sarcastic when I say just a bit because we need a lot for Gen Z and Gen Alpha to succeed, or else they're just going to be walking into something pretty heavy. So Gen Z won't get a full episode here. They've been part of the conversation already, and they're going to be a major part of this episode and being the future generation. So, but today is about millennials. Now, this is where the timeline really starts to pivot. In the previous episode, I started introducing the idea of the analog to digital ratio. Basically, how much of a generation's life was lived without constant connectivity versus with it. Because there's no way around it. The combination of the internet and the smartphone, instant, constant access to infinite information, changed everything. Significantly more than an automobile, in my personal opinion. The silent generation, I've talked about the automobiles in several episodes, but specifically to that early generation, the automobile, in my opinion, changed so much of society. But for reference, I've been using a couple of anchor points, a couple of years to kind of signify that split in the ratio. The internet became commercially accessible in 1993. But I've been using 96 as a cleaner line in the sand, if you will. For smartphones, while earlier versions existed, I used 2006 as the marker, just before the first iPhone release in 2007, the smart iPhone. I'm using 2006 and 1996. Something I didn't really even think about. It kind of made clean math because it's 2026, so I don't know if it did or not, but that wasn't my intentions. When you look at the boomers, they lived roughly 70% of their lives in a fully analog world. 70%. Only about 25 to 30% digital with the smartphone. Gen X starts to close that gap a little bit, landing somewhere between roughly 33 and 43% digital. They approached that midpoint but didn't quite cross it. Millennials are where that balance shifts. Around the mid-'80s, it's actually 1986 to be exact, and it's always shifting as time moves on, but you start to see a true 50-50 split in 1986. I was born in 84, so my ratio is almost there. So I think I'm 48% analog, 52% digital, right on the edge, and I think that's pretty cool. Why? I have no idea, but I do think it's pretty cool. I think it's significant to our personalities for sure. But that balance matters more than people give it credit for, because it's not just about access. It's about when that access happens, at what age they're given this technology. Gen X, for example, encountered the internet in their mid to late teens. Where at exactly? I got my spreadsheet here. they experienced it. Internet's 16 to 31. So the younger Gen Xers got access to the internet at the age of 16. The older ones, 31. Smartphones in their late 20s. I think 26 for the younger Gen Xers and 41 for the older Gen Xers was when the smartphone came out. At that age, your relationship to technology is fundamentally different. You're using it as a tool. Compare that to someone who gets access to it at the age of 10, 13, 16, maybe even 18. The intent changes. The way it shapes identity and communication, attention, it's completely different. What they're going to do on that cell phone is totally different than somebody at the age of 13, 16. That's my point. It's completely different. And boomers, it's a whole different conversation. We still have to teach them how to use it. Sorry, boomers. But with millennials, there's no denying this. We're the first generation whose childhood sits directly on that dividing line. One foot in the analog world and, in their childhood, their upbringing, and the other stepping into a fully digital world. And that split, it defines a lot of what comes next. It defines a lot of our personality. The childhood of millennials can look very different depending on where you fall in the timeline as well. I mentioned it in the monologue, whether you're an older millennial or a younger one. And I think this happens for every generation. I can't say, but I bet it does. But being a millennial myself, it feels more pronounced. Part of that for me is that I relate a lot to Gen X, especially the younger Gen Xers. I had older siblings. My oldest brother was born in 1980. So a lot of what I was exposed to skewed a little bit more mature. Naturally, I gravitated in that direction. But then you look at millennials born in, say, 1995, and it almost feels like they're entirely different people. The culture they grew up in, the access they had to entertainment and media and technology, it's drastically different. Think about it this way. Younger millennials were born into a world where the internet already existed. It was there from the start. Meanwhile, older millennials were teenagers when it showed up. 13, 14, 15, 16. Totally different. That changes everything. The childhood of older millennials, like Gen X to a degree, had to be filled differently. It relied much more on imagination, on being outside, on figuring out ways to occupy your time without constant digital input. Not identical to Gen X or boomers, but closer to that than what came after. And at that same time, millennials grew up during what I'd argue was one of the greatest eras of pop culture, especially the 90s into the 2000s. It's the best by far. Both. All of it. The movies were incredible. And yeah, it could be debated. You could try to debate it, but not really. The movies were the best. I mentioned a few in the Gen X episode, like Home Alone and Jurassic Park and Twister, and there's so many. I could go on and on. I brought those up specifically to stay on the topic. I brought up the Goonies and Stand By Me, which lean more to Gen X, those early 80s ones, especially the older Gen X. But even something, and there's older movies that older Gen X people love that I never even watched. I never even got into because the technology, the humor just wasn't. It was just, it wasn't for me. But, like movies like Jingle All the Way, not necessarily a cult classic. I was using that for the theme of the overworked parents or the distracted households. Kids navigating that space, that was everywhere. That's why I brought those up. But that's just a small taste of it. And there's so many movies from the 90s and early 2000s that are the best. And Gen X can claim some of them for sure. That's fair. But those were millennial childhood staples too. Right? We were right there with it. So I don't know who gets to claim them. I think they're more millennial ones, but potato. A big reason that era hit so hard is because so many firsts were happening. With technology advancing so fast, with the rise of the internet and access to information, both for professionals and just everyday people, everything accelerated extremely fast. Look at the movies like Jurassic Park or Twister. The computer graphics alone blew our minds at the time, for sure. I tell my son that, or my daughter that, they're just like, what? Like they can't believe that was mind blowing, but it was. And it wasn't just the visuals; it was the storytelling. I mean, the dialogue, the storytelling just felt relatable, grounded, but still pushing boundaries. Music exploded the same way. By far, best music decade of all time. Debatable, but I think just sheer quality of bangers puts it at the top. Entire genres were branching into subgenres, which then split again into micro subgenres. I mean, there was so much music happening at the time. The landscape just kept expanding. A lot to do with technology, a lot to do with just, once again, everything growing so fast. I was a bit of a metalhead. Just think of all of the different metal genres, the sub-metal genres that were created, the new metal, the Deftone, Limp Bizkit, that whole world. Then you had Slipknot. Don't get me going, Slipknot. That whole genre was created. That's kind of late, or maybe late 90s, early 2000s. Then you had the industrial metal with like the Static X, and I could go on and on about that, but I won't. MTV had a lot to do with it as well. It's something I should have emphasized more for the Gen X episode. MTV may be their baby. It may be. We definitely got on that train as millennials. But MTV was massive. Kids nowadays will never understand. By the time I was growing up, it was a centerpiece. The TV was always on MTV. TRL and Carson Daly. I mean, you'd go home and see who dropped a new music video. That's how we were fed our new music. Some of us, at least. That's how you kept up. Music videos weren't just clips. They were mini movies sometimes. Like Michael Jackson's videos, he set the standard early. The Thriller and crazy, I was going to say movie, but there were music videos that were produced like movies. High production, cinematic, storytelling, using technology that most people didn't even have access to yet. Movie makers. It was top tier entertainment. And in a way, if you think about it, it was kind of our first taste of short form content. It wasn't your hour and a half movies, were 5 minute, sometimes maybe 8-10 minute long videos. That was our first taste of short form content. That was our social feed. But then the technology kept evolving. It wasn't the streaming era yet, for sure. Not even close in the mid-90s. It wasn't there. But things were becoming more accessible. And then you hit a major shift in 2005 with YouTube. 2005, YouTube started to really grow. Everybody started seeing YouTube videos in 2006. But look at the age gap again. Younger millennials are 10 years old in 2005. Older millennials are 20, give or take. That difference in age, again, completely changes how the platform is used. For a 10-year-old, it can be passive, something just to watch, something that keeps you occupied. For a teenager or somebody in their 20s, it becomes a tool, a platform, a creative outlet. This is where things in the entertainment world really started to open up. Before, entertainment was mostly hand-fed, handed down by and through the major studios, record labels, networks. Now, anyone can upload anything. Joe Schmo's uploading skateboard videos and just rainbow videos. Everybody can create. Anyone can create. And this is where you start to see the early version of what we now think of as the viral culture. Call it a modern day jackass effect, if you will. People making their own content, their own stunts, their own music, their own ideas, and putting it out there for the world. Not all of it was good. Far from it. So much terrible content out there, and there still is. That wasn't the point. The shift was this. We weren't just consuming entertainment anymore. We could make it. And that changes so much. But millennials didn't just adopt the technology. We came up with it. We grew alongside of it. We were teaching our parents how to, set up the routers and troubleshoot the printers. We had to. And that matters because having access to instantaneous, essentially infinite information at a younger age changes how you think. And we all know it's not all reliable information, but it's available. And that alone has the tendency to shift something. Makes people think. It makes people question more and earlier. Previous generations, for the most part, grew up in environments where what your parents told you or what your teachers told you, that was it. That was your framework. And sure, you might question some things later in life, but early on, that structure was pretty fixed. It was hand-fed. It is what it is. Here's the world. And you may hear different things from your friends, but that's the source of information. Millennials didn't have that same limitation. You start reading things online, you start seeing different perspectives, seeing different data, seeing arguments, and you realize, wait, the people online are just people, just like me. And if they're presenting information that's backed up, even partially, curiosity kicks in. And once that door opens, it doesn't really close. You start asking questions, big ones. Did Christopher Columbus really discover a new world? That's how many of us were taught growing up. But then you start seeing other perspectives, other historical accounts, and you realize it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's much more complicated than that. And that moment, that shift, it's an eye-opener. And once you notice one inconsistency, you start wondering what else might be incomplete, oversimplified, or just wrong. It expands your mental horizon in a way that's hard to really fully measure. Every new piece of information creates new connections in your brain, new pathways, new associations, new curiosities. And when that's happening at a younger age, at scale, with constant input, the impact is incredible. But it's not just about access to old information. It's about real-time information too. I've touched on this in previous episodes, the difference between consuming news before the internet and after it. Before you had newspapers, local TV, radio, and just a limited number of stories, a limited number of inputs, selected editors, filtered through local and sometimes national outlets that created a kind of informational bubble. And I don't think older generations always fully grasp how different that is, because now the scope is completely different. Instead of maybe 20, 30, 40 stories a day, many of them local, you now have access to everything. Stories from across the country, across the world, instantly. Back then, if something happened in Santa Monica and you lived in St. Louis, you probably never heard about it. Why would you? It wasn't relevant to your local paper. Now, not only can you hear about it, you can find hundreds of similar stories in seconds if you go looking. And this is where perception starts to shift. Now, there's this common idea that the world is more dangerous now than it used to be. That things were simpler, safer, more stable. But that's not true. That's not true at all. do some investigative work on your Google, on your phone right now, and search it. Crime has always existed. Violence has always existed. In fact, in some areas, like serial killings, people have killed multiple people. Rates have actually dropped significantly since the 1980s due to things like improved forensics and DNA databases and surveillance or cameras everywhere, and just broader law enforcement tools. I did some investigative work. I'll try to spit some numbers out here. And these numbers take them however you want, but just the number of active serial killers back in 1980, 240. That's active people that they were knowingly killing more than two people. There's 240 active serials around 1980. 5 years. I was searching in increments of 5. So in 1985, it actually went up. 85 was a bad year. 275, serial killers. In 1990, it was 220. 1995, it was 150 serial killers. In the year 2000, it was 110 serial killers. I may have messed that up. In the year 2000, it was 110 serial killers. 2005, it went down to 75. Now we're getting into the internet. 2010, down to 40 active serial killers. Now, was it caught? Was it not caught? I think it was. I think it's just active. They potential serial killers on the loose. 2015, down to 25 serial killers. And then 2020, 2025, it's anywhere between 15 and 25 serial killers. So it's a decline of 700% serial killers. Now, I'm using these bland terms and these generic numbers, but do the research. That's a major reduction in crime. I also looked up just homicide rates, and they're just as drastic. I won't go through all of them, but in 1980, there's 23,040. It wasn't just murders. It was murders and manslaughter. I don't really know what it was, but 23,000. I'll skip to year 2000, drops to 15,590, to where 2025, it's around 14,000. So 1980, 23,040. 2025, 14,000. Crime has actually gone down significantly, but it feels more dangerous now. Does it not? I'm guilty of it. I was a helicopter parent for a long time just because I felt like the world was just more scary. And a big part of that is exposure. Because now, if you want to, you can find hundreds of incidents, burglaries, assaults, violent crimes from across the country in a matter of minutes. You can aggregate that information and say, look how bad things are. This world is scary. But you're pulling from a much larger pool. Before, maybe your local area had a handful of reported incidents. Now you're comparing that to hundreds, if not thousands nationwide, or even globally, because that data is available, and treating it like it's all happening in your immediate environment. That's a completely different scale, but we have access to it. Everybody does. And when you don't account for that difference, it becomes pretty easy to skew perception, to feel like things are spiraling, even if the underlying reality hasn't changed in the same proportion. In my opinion, it happens all the time, and millennials were really the first generation to really live inside that shift, to grow up with that level of connection, that level of exposure, and that level of cognitive load. At that age, I should say, everybody lived through it. All the generations lived through it. But when the millennials started to live through it, is different. And it comes with a consequence. One thing that did happen instantaneously back then, sometimes, back then, before everything became constant, there were these live shared moments. There weren't many, but when they happened, everyone watched. Everyone remembers where they were during the O.J. Simpson Bronco chase. That's one of those moments that just sticks. A lot of people probably remember where they were when the verdict came in, too. I was live. I was everywhere. And in my opinion, intentionally. That's a different conversation. Then there's 9/11. That was a big one. I remember exactly where I was. And most Gen Xers and Millennials do, even Boomers. Most people do. I was in high school, junior year, maybe senior year, I'm not sure. Biology class. They rolled the big old box TV in on the big old thing with wheels with the TV on it, and everything just stopped. It was a strange day. It was a heavy day. Moments like that weren't just events. They were shared experiences, and they shaped how we saw the world. But when you look at millennials specifically, it's not just what happened, it's when it happened. All these events impacted every generation that was alive at the time. Like I said, Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, even some Gen Z. But for Millennials, many of these hit right as we were trying to build our lives. Whether it was high school or just a little bit after high school, the effects were just after that. 9/11 changed a lot, culturally, politically, globally, financially too, in ways I won't pretend to really fully break down, but what came after had very direct economic consequences. Then you had the Great Recession in 2008. That was a big one. I was in my early 20s, just getting into what I thought was my first real stable job, and then everything shifted. And looking back, it influenced way more than I realized at the time. Life decisions, relationships. I actually got married. That's just life decisions, and things happen. Things that felt personal were also being shaped by larger economic forces. I was working nonstop, 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week across multiple jobs. So financially, I managed. But that came at a cost. At the time, you don't always see it. You just grind through it. And that's one example. But there were several. Then you get into 2020, COVID-19. That, to me, feels like the dividing line, a before and after. For me, it hits a little bit more differently as well. I got sober in 2019, right before the pandemic hit the States. So my perspective is a little unique. My pre-COVID world and post-COVID world feel completely different. And part of that is personal, but part of that is something much bigger. When I was drinking before the pandemic every day, and then the pandemic hits and we're all stuck at home. Social events, major events, concerts, everybody was at home. I got sober, and then when things started to normalize, I was sober and the world was totally different. Everything changed. It was crazy. It's still crazy. People stayed home. The way we worked changed. The way we interacted changed. And economically, something major shifted, especially with housing and the cost of living. And again, there are people much more qualified than me to break down the exact mechanics of it. I can only speak to what I've seen and what we're still dealing with. The cost of everyday goods went up and stayed up significantly. Housing, though, that's where things really stand out. Home prices skyrocketed. And the explanation you hear most often, I think, is supply and demand. Low supply, high demand. And on paper, that makes sense, maybe a little bit. But when you really start thinking about it, it raises questions, at least for me. Why was supply so constrained? It wasn't like a baby boomer level population surge all hitting the market at once. Was it private equity firms buying up a lot of those houses? Yeah. But once again, I'm nobody. At the same time, millennials were hitting adulthood in waves, just a little bit. And here's a stat that puts things into perspective a little bit. The average age of a first-time home buyer now is around 40 years old, which seems a little high, doesn't it? Well, it is. Before 2020, it was closer to 30. I think it was like 32, 33. But that drastic change happened because of 2020, because of the pandemic. That's a massive shift in a very short period of time. You've got younger millennials entering their prime, ready to start a life, late 20s, early 30s, right as housing becomes just significantly less accessible. Meanwhile, older millennials had just started to get their footing before everything shifted again. And layered on top of that, you've got workforce changes, people going into retirement early, wage increases that were arguably overdue, supply chain disruptions, all of it feeding into rising costs across the board. I go deeper into that in the inflation episode I did a while back, so I won't really rehash all of it here, but the key point is this. Millennials didn't just experience these events. We hit them at the exact moments we were trying to build stability, and that timing changes everything. Now, me, for example, I bought my first house young. I was 21, maybe 22, maybe even 23, but I think I was closer to 22. I just landed what I considered my first big boy job, and I went all in. I was working my tail off. They offered as many hours as you could take, as you wanted, and I took full advantage of that. 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week. Overtime, it was a good structure, time and a half, double time, all that good stuff. The bonuses, they had a good bonus program working, and I took full advantage of it. The work itself was meaningful, but it bought me a house, bought me a couple houses. I saw potential, so I stuck my neck out and committed to it. At the same time, my ex-wife had a college degree in design and was bringing in a solid income too. I think I was making more, but doesn't matter. Together, we were in a position to make something happen. So we did. I think eventually she stayed home when we had our first kids. So, I was working my tail off. But together we made something happen. And I bought my first house around 2006, 2007. No college degree, just straight into the workforce, figuring it all out as I went. That was my mindset. Work hard, stay smart, and you'll find a way forward. And it worked. We followed what was, at the time, a pretty standard path. You buy a home, you invest in it, upgrade, you improve it, and you sell it, and try to make a profit on it. Build equity. After about 5 or 6 years and a lot of renovations, we sold that first house. And right when we got it to where we wanted it to be, of course, but we made a solid profit. That profit became the down payment for the next house. Bigger, better, an upgrade. And that's how it's supposed to work. Your home becomes your biggest investment. You build equity, roll it forward, and keep climbing. We did that. Again, that second house we put a ton of work into as well. It turned out so awesome. I'm super proud of that house. But then life happened. We got divorced, 2018. Sold the house, split the profit, and went our separate ways. I won't get into all the specifics, probably saying too much just by saying that. But it's relevant to the story. Even with that split, we split all of our profit, and I still had enough. We both still had enough money to put money into our next houses. I was still in a position to move forward. Later in 2018, I bought the home I'm in right now. It's just a ranch. If things had gone differently, sure, I might have been working with more capital, but even with half, I was ahead of the game. And that's the point. I got in early. A lot of millennials didn't. A lot of them followed a different path. That one they were told was the right one. Graduate high school, go to college, get a degree, aim for that corporate job, that office job. That was the message from a lot of the Gen X parents. You don't want to work those labor-intensive jobs, go to school. So they did. They went to college, lived in dorms, apartments, did everything right, got their degrees, and then they stepped out into the real world and ran straight into 2020. Now, housing prices, and by the way, the different generations, what ages they were in 2020. Silent generation was 92 to 75. It's irrelevant somewhat. The baby boomers were 56 to 74 years old in 2020. Gen X was 40 years old to 55 years old in 2020. Millennials were 24 to 39 years old in 2020. And Gen Z was 8 to 23. That millennial 24 to 39 years old, that's what I'm talking about. This is a generation that are ready to get out there and start contributing to the workforce, and you can not do it with a house. That's a problem, because now housing is through the roof. Completely, rent is through the roof. You're looking at $2,000 a month, roughly. That's here in the Midwest. $2,000 a month for a 2-bedroom, just an apartment. $2,000 a month, and I can't imagine what it was like in the big cities. Probably $2,000, $5,000 a month for a 1-bedroom. I have no idea, but $2,000 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment, that's just unrealistic. No, that's not a stepping stone. That's a wall. And a lot of younger millennials walked into a situation that was fundamentally different than what they were promised. And then they're told, well, you just don't want to work, do you? That's a problem. It's not fair, in my opinion. And a lot of millennials, I think, say that, and a lot of the older generations can't comprehend why the younger generations say it. Gen X boomers had time. At 40 years old to 55 years old, and the older boomers, they had enough time to buy a house, 2 houses, 3 houses, 4 houses, 5 houses, sell them, and you have equity. Buying, selling, buying, selling, buying, selling. They build up equity. By the time 2020 hits, they don't need a house. Their mortgage is still at the rate they had in 95. They had time. They had a runway. Millennials, especially the younger half, hit the game right as the rules changed. But then you hit another layer of this, the cost of living. And it's through the roof, across the board. We all know this. At the same time, the narrative starts circulating through the media, through conversations, through, the boomer diners talk, the conversations at the diner with the boomers, that younger generations just don't want to work anymore. You still hear it today. I heard it from my own mom recently. These young people just don't want to work. And look, there is some truth to that. I know there is, but there's also context. There's a reason behind it. And I'll get into that here in a little bit, but a big part of the disconnect comes from perception, in my opinion. Older generations look at how younger people are living and think, you've got all these nice things, these luxuries. You got your Netflix, your big TV, and your phone, and you're eating your avocado toast, and you're saying, then you're just doing all that, and you're saying you can't afford this house. Maybe you should just work a little harder. That's not how it works. But what's getting lost in all of it is how the cost structure has flipped. Things that used to be considered luxury items, things that signaled wealth, are now relatively cheap. Take TVs, for example. Back in the day, a big 30-inch or 40-inch TV could cost $1,000, $2,000, maybe more. With inflation, that's $3,000, $4,000 today. That's a major purchase. Only the wealthy could really afford those. Think about it. Now, you can get a 60 or 7-inch flat screen for $300 or $400, maybe $500. You can get with smart TV with Netflix on it. That's affordable. That the ratio of what that costs and the affordability they're not even the same ballpark. That's a massive shift. And that can be perceived differently from older generations. When those older generations see someone with a big TV and all these subscriptions and the devices, they're associating it with what that used to cost. It looks like overspending. It looks like poor financial discipline. And it might be, to be fair. Sometimes it is. There are definitely cases where money management could be better. I'll be the first to admit it. I've struggled with that myself, but I've gotten significantly better. But it's not easy, because on the other side of that, you've got an environment where everything is being marketed to you constantly. They're listening to it and throwing you ads of what you're talking about. We all know this is happening. That's heavy marketing. That I don't even know that's aggressive marketing. Subscription payment plans. You can get anything you want, $5-10 a month, with just a clickety clack on your phone. It's never been as easy as it is now to spend money, almost in invisible increments. So is it poor financial habits, or is it incredibly effective high pressure marketing? Probably both. But here's the key difference. While luxury and entertainment items have gotten cheaper, the necessities have gone the opposite direction. Housing, through the roof. Food, through the roof. Healthcare, out of this world. Even vehicles, significantly higher than they've ever been. The things you need to build a stable life are the things that have become the most expensive. And that's where the frustration really comes from. Because you can cut Netflix. You can skip eating out. But that doesn't suddenly make a house affordable. It doesn't bring down the cost of groceries or healthcare in any meaningful way. Now, what's driving all that? That's a bigger conversation, for sure. Now, you could point to supply chains and policy and global events, but a lot of people, myself included, look at it and see a heavy influence of corporate incentives and profit structures pushing things higher and higher and higher. Call it what you want, but the result is the same. A system where the visible spending looks irresponsible, while the invisible costs, the ones that actually matter, keep climbing. And that gap between perception and reality is where a lot of this generational tension lives. It's easy to label millennials as a generation that doesn't want to work, that just wants comfort and convenience and, the avocado toast. But what if it's something else? What if it's a generation that's starting to question what working is actually for? Maybe they want to do what feels right. Maybe they want to spend time with their fucking kids. Maybe they actually want to be present in their families. Now, here's the flip side of that. Because it matters, a lot of millennials aren't even having kids. Same with Gen Z. I don't have all the exact numbers in front of me, but it's a clear trend. Fewer people are choosing to start families, and they're doing it later, some of them, if at all. Living the dink life, dual income, no kids. It's popular, super popular. And if someone looks at that and says it's selfish or short-sighted, I think that misses the reality completely. Because look at this. Look at this shit show. The cost of living is through the roof. Housing is expensive. Rent is expensive. Basic stability is harder to achieve. So the question becomes, why would someone bring a child into this situation if they're not ready? That's not irresponsibility. That's awareness. Because raising a child without the financial foundation in place doesn't just work itself out. It often forces one or both parents into a constant state of overwork, pushing beyond healthy limits just to keep up. And that kind of pressure builds, and it turns into stress, anxiety, burnout. And historically, what have people done with that kind of pressure? A lot of times, they look for relief, whether that's alcohol or something stronger. And that's where I think something important is happening with millennials. Another thing, and this one's one of my favorite and one of the biggest ones, in many cases, we're breaking cycles. Think about it. Alcohol consumption, for example, has been trending downward significantly, especially compared to previous generations. That's a big deal because addiction, especially alcohol abuse, has had ripple effects across generations. My family's a perfect example. It doesn't just impact one person. It affects entire families, generations of families. A toxic household, instability, abuse, whether physical or emotional, those things shape kids. And those kids grow up carrying that with them. Sometimes they repeat it. Sometimes they pass it on without even realizing it. That's how cycles continue. So when you see a generation pulling back from that, being more aware of it, more cautious about it, that's not weakness. That's progress. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying alcohol itself is the problem for everyone. No, but there's plenty of people that can have a healthy relationship with it. I couldn't. That's the reality of it. And those that can, it's awesome for you. Good for you. You can moderate it. You can control it. That's awesome. But for many, we can't. But it doesn't change the fact that addiction has damaged millions of families across multiple generations. So if millennials are contributing to a reduction in that, if they're more intentional about when or if they even want to start a family, that's not something to dismiss. That's something to pay attention to because it might actually be one of the most important shifts happening right now. I think millennials are breaking cycles more than any generation before them. And what gets labeled as complaining or laziness might actually be something much simpler. Maybe people just want to work a realistic number of hours and then go home and spend real time with their fucking families. I don't know why that gets framed as weakness. That part bothers me. I always go back to the snow day reference that I've been making over the last couple of episodes. The snow day example, because it makes total sense to me. People talk about how, back in the day, kids walked miles to school. Some walk 5 to 10 miles to school both ways with socks for gloves, all that stuff, That's what our parents were saying, the older generations. But now school gets canceled sometimes the night before, just for a dusting or the worry of a dusting or a worry of an inch or two. They'll call it off. And some of the reaction is, oh, these kids are soft, But what if canceling school early is actually the smarter move? If it prevents accidents and reduces traffic chaos and keeps people safe, then maybe that's not weakness. Maybe it's progress. Maybe the old way wasn't better, just harder. That idea applies to a lot of what we're seeing now. Why is preparation seen as weakness? Why is reducing unnecessary risk seen as laziness? A lot of it, in my opinion, comes down to perspective and sometimes resistance. And I get it more than I used to because I caught myself doing it just the other day. Same thing. I was talking to my brother recently about the idea of student loan forgiveness. And my immediate reaction was anger. No, what if we pay them all off? I'm like, no, that's not fair at all. Because in my mind, if I had known loans might be forgiven someday, maybe I would have made different decisions. And I chose not to take that debt because it didn't make sense to me at the time, and it still doesn't make sense to me. But what if I did? What if, my reaction was based on that? I didn't get that benefit, so why should they? But then I sat with it, and I realized that reaction wasn't really about fairness. It was about comparison. Because if something like that actually improves people's lives and maybe even helps the broader economy, then maybe it's a net positive, regardless of whether I personally benefited from it or not. That was a shift for me. I I couldn't, I caught myself and I was just like, you silly dog, what are you doing? In that moment, I understood how older generations can struggle with change, especially when that change makes things easier for the people coming after them. That mindset of, I struggled, so you should too. It's human, but that doesn't make it right, because the goal shouldn't be to preserve struggle. It should be to reduce it. Working nonstop just to barely get by, just to help someone else climb higher and buy another island, buy another sports car, it doesn't feel sustainable. It doesn't feel necessary. Maybe there's a better version of this. Maybe a full-time job should provide a livable wage, reasonable wage. Maybe 40 hours should be enough to build a life, not just survive. Healthcare is another example. I won't pretend to understand all the complexities, but it's hard to ignore that it's heavily profit-driven. And at the same time, you have incredibly skilled professionals, surgeons and specialists, who absolutely deserve to be compensated well, for sure. Those two things shouldn't have to be in conflict. There should be a way to support both, reward expertise, and still provide access to care. Because right now, it can feel like you're born into a system where survival itself comes with a bill attached to it. And that raises a bigger question. Is this how it's supposed to be? Something about that feels off. And I think more and more people are starting to recognize it. The challenge is, when you lived inside a system your entire life and endured it, it can feel unfair to watch it change for others, right? It can feel like your struggle is being dismissed. But holding on to that mindset keeps the cycle going. Millennials are starting to push against that, and Gen Z is right behind them, pushing even harder. And these aren't abstract groups. These are your kids, your grandkids, your families. You want better for your own. Of course you do. The question is, do you want better for everyone else's too? Because a system that only works for some and relies on others staying stuck isn't really working. And whether people want to admit it or not, the system we're in right now is showing cracks, big ones. The change is already happening. The only question is who is willing to recognize it and who is going to fight it. It's kind of crazy. Throughout this entire season, almost every episode, I've come back to this idea. We need to focus on doing the things we love and find a way for those things to become our contributions to society and be paid for it. A real livable wage. Do we need mansions? No, of course not. Do we need all of these convenience-based services that keep us on the couch scrolling and binging and disconnected? I know a lot of people don't want to hear this, but no, we don't. Because those conveniences come at a cost. And not just financially, but structurally. Behind every cheap convenience is a chain of low-paying, often thankless jobs, split up, optimized, and scaled to make everything faster, cheaper, more accessible. But in that system, nobody really wins. Because someone has to do those jobs. And who is that someone? Who is that someone supposed to be? Think about it. Is it supposed to be our kids? Your neighbor's kids, other people's kids, teens in general? Just teens, just young people. Young adults. We'll just say young adults, not mine. No? Well, who's it going to be? Migrants? Native workers? Natives? Fuck no. That's ludicrous. That's insanity. But I feel like that's some of the unsaid things that people just kind of, poof, somebody's got to do it. It's not good. That's not a real solution. In the past, this system kind of worked. Maybe for a while. The silent generation kind of experienced it. The boomers, They probably experienced it some, a little bit. Gen X to some degree. You're getting there, right? You got a little taste of it. The older ones got a little bit of the taste of it. But what we've been calling the American dream, it's not as attainable as it once was. It feels like the table is just being cleared off. Just take it all off. Like a lot of the resources, the opportunity, the stability are being just taken off the table just as older generations step away. Whether it's intentional or not, what's left feels limited. And I feel like, and this is total assumption, but it feels like a lot of the older generations are doing it because they recognize the fear for the future. There's not going to be left, so they need to take as much as they have. So when they retire, they're going to be all right, and their kids are going to be all right. I've seen more retired people going back to work part-time or doing side jobs as they're retired now more than ever. And now millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha are left trying to make something out of the crumbs on the table. And if you can't see that shift happening, then you're missing something important because it's real. And honestly, it's a little terrifying. Fuck that. It is really terrifying. I don't always know what to tell my kids. I don't know what path to point them toward because nothing feels stable. Everything is changing fast, and they see it too. It's like they're standing at the bottom of a hill that just keeps getting taller and taller and taller, and at some point, it just starts to look unclimbable. And as a parent, that's a hard feeling to sit with. I've worked hard my entire life, and I have a home, kind of. The bank owns it, but I'm paying them, so I kind of have a home. I have a car. But when I look at what success looks like through their eyes, it doesn't always feel like I've given them a clear path forward. In some ways, that feels like failure a little bit, and I hate to fail. I hate it. But in other ways, I'm confident I have done something right. My kids are kind, very kind, and that matters to me more than anything. Now, does the current system we're in reward kindness? Not really, unfortunately. That's a problem because it often rewards the opposite of it. To be successful, you need to be ruthless, manipulation, cutting corners, selling something you know isn't right, and just not telling the full truth. That's how you get to become successful most of the time. Not all the time. There's exceptions. But that's a reality that's hard to ignore. And it's part of why I've questioned where I fit in all of this. But what I've tried to teach my kids is just be kind. But have boundaries. Don't let the world take advantage of that. Will that be enough? I don't know. I think they're going to be okay. They're smart, man. They're smart and beautiful. But that concern, that question about the future, it's always there. Every morning I wake up, that's what I think about. When I go to sleep thinking about it. But that's really the core of why I started this entire podcast. Trying to make some kind of impact. Trying to think about the future for them and for generations after. Because right now, I don't love the direction we're heading. I hate it. I'm terrified of it. What's interesting is, this series, this whole season, it naturally built to this point, and I didn't plan for this, but every episode led here. There's always been a common theme. It seems like I did not intentionally do this, but but in a way, it kind of all ties together. I don't blame any one person or any one generation for where we are, but we're here. So instead of arguing about how we got here, maybe it's time to focus on how we move forward. That's together, not divided. Not divided by politics, not divided by race, by generation, but together. Republican, Democrat, Black, White, Hispanic, Asian, Boomer, Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z. We have to figure this out together. Thanks for tuning in all season long. I really do appreciate it. It's been fun. We've gone over quite a whole bunch of different things I didn't really know I would talk about, but it's been fun, and I hope you guys liked it. I will be back with more content soon, whether it's season 2. I don't know when that'll be, but sometime. In the meantime, I may be shifting some focus into some music. You can find some of my music on YouTube. Maddie Wayne Music is the channel. I've got some music on the streaming platforms under the name Maddie Wayne as well. I hate that name, by the way. Maddie, Matty Wayne. Yeah, it's so dumb, but that's the name I went with. I've got a handful of songs out there. Check them out. Maddie Wayne Music on YouTube. Bunch of covers, a whole bunch of stuff on there. So I'm going to keep creating. I'm going to keep trying to say meaningful shit. Just because we need meaningful things to be said. So until then, stay positive, stay strong, and I'll see you later.